If you want to follow along, go ahead and turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. A scene that plays out in many households with young children in the evening. You need to go brush your teeth. But I don't want to brush my teeth. Oh, but you need to go brush your teeth because if you don't brush your teeth will rot. So? Well, you don't want your teeth to rot, do you? You need to go brush your teeth because your breath will smell bad. So? We don't want your breath to smell bad, do you? Why? And around it goes. And finally, you get to that one trump card that every parent can play. You need to go brush your teeth because I said so. Now, because I said so means my reasons haven't been good enough for you, and I'm tired of explaining it to you, so you are going to do it because I said so. Now, when I was young, I said I would never, ever tell my children anything because I said so. It didn't take long of having children till I said because I said so. Because children will put you at that exasperated spot where you just want to pull your hair out and you just say, because I said so. But you know what? God never says, because I said so. And if anybody ever had the right to say, do this because I said so, God has that right. I mean, He made us. He is the creator of the universe. He is all-powerful, omniscient. He is everything. And if anybody ever had the right to say, look, do it because I said. In fact, God could have written the Bible, and He could have written a list of things for you and I to do, and a list of things we could avoid, and He could say, here's what you need to do, here's what you need to not do, and do it because I said so. And you know what? He'd had the right to do that. But God does not say, do it because I said so. In fact, the Bible, when it gives us things that we are to do for God, God always gives us reasons that He likes us to do that. Always gives us reasons He wants us to do that. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, I want to look at some of those. But first, let's look at some of the things He tells us not to do. Let's start in chapter 2. We're going to read first verses 1 through 3. Therefore, putting aside all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy and envy, and all slander, like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow up in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. There's several no's here that he says, several things that we are not to do. We're not to have malice. That is, that we are not to look at each other and dislike each other and let that affect how we treat each other. Now, we're not even really supposed to dislike each other. That's a challenge sometimes, isn't it? Be honest. It's a challenge sometimes. There are people in here, in this building today, that you probably struggle with loving. Doesn't matter. It's natural. But we are called to love them anyway, and we are sure called to not let that struggle we have in loving them affect how we treat them. We are to treat them with love, regardless of if we've gotten the warm fuzzies about them yet, okay? Don't have malice. No deceit. Don't be somebody who walks around trying to deceive people into thinking things that aren't true. Don't have hypocrisy. Don't pretend to be something that you really aren't. Don't walk around like you're better than everybody else when you're really just the same as they are. You're not supposed to do that. Don't envy. Don't wish you had what somebody else had, or wish that you were what somebody else was. You're not supposed to envy. You're not supposed to slander. I'm not supposed to say anything bad about somebody else that is inaccurate. And you know what? You might say, oh, well, it's not really slander because it might be true. I just don't know. If you don't know, it's slander. Okay? Because you're saying something that might or might not be true. And then he has some do's. He says, long for the milk of the Word. Long for getting into God's Word and seeing what it's all about. And then grow in respect to your salvation. And then let's jump down to verses 11 and 12. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts that wage war against your soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. Some more things. Abstain from fleshly lust. Those things that we are called to do just by the nature of our bodies, that can come to control and define us even to our detriment, we are to abstain from those. We're to run away from those. And then we're called to, as we live, keep our behavior excellent. In other words, God says y'all need to behave. Y'all need to behave. Y'all need to behave and do good things and not do any of these bad things. And as he goes through it, what he does in the middle of those verses I read 1 through 3, and then I read 11 through 12. Well, in the middle, he gives us the reasons. He doesn't just say, do this because I said so. But he gives us several reasons. So let's read that middle passage, verses 4 through 10. And coming to him as a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is the choice and precious in the sight of God, you also, as living stones, are being built up into a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I laid in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value then is for you who believe, but for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected has become the very cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this doom they were also appointed. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you might proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you were once not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. I really want us to focus this morning on this list of things that we have become, and the reason that God says don't do these things and do these things is because of what God has made us. It's not just because he told us so, but it's because God has made us into something when we become his people. He has changed us. Before we became a Christian, we were an old creature. We were a creature who lived in these very things he's telling us to avoid. And we avoided the very things he's telling us to do. But when we become a new creature, then we have a new perspective, and he has expectations of us. And he begins to describe, probably in my thoughts, in 1 Peter chapter 2, is one of the most vivid descriptions of what we have become as Christians and what we are as Christians. First, he says we're a living stone. We're a living stone. That word up until 1 Peter chapter 2 is only used of Jesus Christ. But he says, you and I, as we become Christians, we have been made into living stones. In other words, what God has done with us is he has recreated us to make us like Jesus. Now we say that when we say Christian, even though we kind of forget what that means. But part of the reason we are to behave is because we have been made to be like Jesus. We have been recreated to be like him. And so behavior inconsistent with that recreation messes up God's whole plan. It destroys everything God did when he recreated us. You know, sometimes I think we get on our little higher horse and go, well, you know, if I'd been in the Garden of Eden, that fruit, I would have avoided that temptation. No, you wouldn't have. You mean tell you why? Because every one of you in here who was baptized was recreated, and have you messed up that recreation since then? Oh, yeah, you have. It may not be the fruit Eve ate, but you ate some fruit. You messed it up a little bit. We have been made to be like Jesus. We have been recreated to be like Him. So our behavior should match what we have been created to be. Isn't God glorious that He didn't wait until our behavior matched to recreate us? If He had waited till our behavior was right before we could be recreated, we'd all be in a mess. But He recreated us and then asks us to make our behavior match the creation He has made us to be. And that is a wonderful reason. Second, he says we are a spiritual house. And I love the reading, or the statement, that church is kind of a glimpse into what God intended the world to be. Oh, yes. The church is a spiritual house. We're part of that spiritual house. When he says house here, he's really meaning household. We are part of a spiritual household. Any of you ever told by your mom or dad not to embarrass the family? Did you ever hear that? Yep, probably did it anyway. But you were told not to embarrass the family. There's a family name. You know, remember who you are. Remember what people think. My daddy was a preacher, so it was a real big deal. If I embarrassed him, I could get him fired. You know? You got to remember that family. We are a spiritual household. That's one reason we are to behave. God has made us a spiritual household, and we need to remember the family name. We need to remember who we belong to and who we are part of. Because what I do as part of this family of God reflects on you. It doesn't just reflect on me. If I go out and do something, they'll go, well, isn't that guy that speaks at Rimmel sometimes? I don't know, that tells me something. Get up there and speak. My actions can reflect on the whole spiritual household. And so I am to behave. He says we are a holy priesthood, offering sacrifices. One of the greatest blessings of the New Testament is I am no longer dependent on another person to approach God for me. Through Jesus Christ, I approach God on my own. It is amazing to me that people will they'll know that I speak at churches, and they'll say, oh, you're a preacher. Would you say a prayer for me? Now, I don't ever mind praying for somebody. I really like praying with somebody better than praying for somebody, but I don't mind it. But the idea that my prayer has any more power than any other Christian's prayer is erroneous. You see, we are a holy priesthood. We are, each one of us, priests set aside by God, and what we do is each one of us offers up sacrifices to God. And because we are the ones that are approaching God's throne, we need to behave. Do most people have a different expectation of preachers than they do other people? When I preached for a small church out in the country, there was a lady she ran this little grocery store, and when I first got there, I'd come in and I'd visit with her, and I'd sit down at the table, and these farmers would come in, and they'd sit down, and many of them hadn't met me, and they'd sit down, and they'd start telling some off-color jokes or using some off-color language, and she loved to let them continue for a little bit, and then she'd walk over the table and say, oh, have you guys met the preacher? Oh, preacher, I am so sorry. If I had known, I'd have never said that. I'd have never talked like that in front of you. And my response always was, look, I'm nothing. If you can talk like that in front of him, what you say in front of me really doesn't matter. You know? Because we're all priests. The preacher's no more special than anybody else. Each of us is a priest, and each of us offers sacrifices to God. And to approach God and offer those sacrifices, we need to do so from a life that is in good behavior with God. We offer those sacrifices. He continues and he says, we are a chosen race. Now this was really big back then because you had Jews, you had Gentiles, you had Romans, you had barbarians, you had all of these people who were mushed together into the church of God in the first century. All these people crammed together, and all of them at one point had hated each other. They had intensely disliked each other, or at least not gotten along. Sometimes they had tried to kill each other. And here they are crammed together, and all of a sudden he says, hey, there's not any of you that's black, white, Hispanic. There's not any of you that's Jew. There's not any of you Greek, barbarian. None of that. That's all gone. You are a chosen race. I have made of you a new race of people. I have made of you what I wanted to make in the Garden of Eden. I have made of you a creation of people for who all of that other stuff is irrelevant. The only relevant thing is that I picked you, and you are chosen. And you need to behave because you are a chosen race. All right, most of us in here are white. Any of you ever seen a white person that makes you ashamed to be white? Uh-huh. You look at them and the way they act, and you're like, oh my goodness, I hope people don't think that's what all white people are like. And their actions makes you ashamed to be associated with them. We are a chosen race. We need to behave so that our race is not defined by our actions. Others in our race are not defined. We were chosen to be God's race, the race of God's people. And if that wasn't powerful enough, he says this priesthood that he mentioned before, and you know the priesthood's important because he mentions it twice. Holy priesthood and a royal priesthood. Now, I wonder what the difference is between being a holy priesthood and a royal priesthood. Oh, I'm glad you asked. You wanted to know that, didn't you? Okay, a holy priesthood, holy means chosen or set apart. Somebody picked you and set you apart for something, okay? Royal means that you were born into it, that you got it by nature of inheritance or your birth, that you were born into it, okay? If we look at the Old Testament, there's this guy named Melchizedek. He was a holy priest. He was chosen into the priesthood. He was not born into it. And Hebrews elaborates on that a lot as it relates to Jesus. Well, the priest of Israel, they were a royal priesthood. You had to be born into the right tribe. You had to be born into the right family to be a priest. So you had this priest that was holy and this priest that was royal. Two different kinds. Which one are we? We're both. We are both chosen for the priesthood, and we are born into the priesthood. We're chosen by God to be priests, and we're born into it through the birth we have in Jesus Christ. And so we come to the priesthood from both ways. That means we are the perfection of what God wanted for His priesthood. We are both chosen and born into it. And because of that, we ought to behave like people who are the priests that God always intended to have. We are to be those who have inherited it and realize that it is a sacred obligation we've been chosen to do. We didn't just luck into it, we were chosen, but we're not just chosen, we were born also through the blood of Christ into this priesthood. So we are to behave. We are a holy nation. A holy nation. We've lost, I think, this concept that we as Christians are a nation. If you were to ask most people, in fact, who call themselves Christians, who are Christians, who work to follow God, are you a Christian first and an American second, or American first and a Christian second? I wonder what percentage would say I'm American first and I'm a Christian second. And what percentage would say I'm a Christian first and an American second? You see, we aren't called to be Americans if we're God's people. God doesn't really care whether we're Americans or not. God does care whether we're Christians. And called to be a Christian, a nation for God, is what's important. I have a good friend who was a conscientious objector. He was going to be drafted for Korea, and he was a conscientious objector. Now, I don't want to get into the debate about whether Christians can be in the military and all that, and I have my opinions on that, but I'm just going to share with you his perspective, okay? This is his perspective. He said the reason he could not fight was that if God called him to fight for America, then God called a Korean Christian to fight for Korea. And he could not see himself standing on a battlefield and pulling a trigger and shooting another Christian. It was inconceivable for him to do that. Now, I want you to see his perspective. You see, his perspective was that the nationality of Christian transcended the nationalities of America or Korea. we were a Christian nation. Not America is a Christian nation. We have been created a Christian nation by God. And no matter what my national background is, or my immigration status, or anything else, I am a Christian first and everything else second, or third or fourth. I have been called to be God's nation. Israel did not always take that calling seriously. In fact, God chose them to be His holy nation, His chosen people. And guess what? They did not behave like His chosen people. In fact, God would continue to get on to them. They'd continue to misbehave. And it'd kind of be like at my house. There was a ping pong paddle on top of the refrigerator. And Mom would say, behave, behave. And that ping pong paddle had those little knobs on it. You know what I'm talking about? And when she would pull it down, it would squeak. And if we ever heard the we knew we had gone too far and there was no backing up. You know, because once the paddle had come off, the paddle was going to be used. You know, it was not going to go back without being used. Okay? And we knew. Well, Israel would push God, push God, push God, push God to the brink, and God would say, look, you're my nation. You're my nation. Please behave like my nation. Please. And He would beg them, and then finally they would get to the point where He would punish them. And maybe for a little while they'd come back and they'd follow, then they'd start misbehaving again, and God would say, okay, come back, come back, come back. And they wouldn't, and He would punish them. If we learn from Israel, is that really the kind of nation we want to be? Do we want to be God's chosen nation who misbehaves to the point that God has to come back, or I'm going to have to punish you? No. As God's nation, we need to obey our King. We need to behave like the nation that has been chosen for Him. And then finally He says, a people for God's own possession. A people for God's own possession. You and I no longer belong to ourselves. We are no longer owned by ourselves. My brother and I loved to build things when we were growing up. We loved to build tree houses, build little forts in the backyard, build all this kind of stuff. And so Dad would be off at work, and we'd get into the shop, and we'd drag out the tools, and we'd start building something. And Dad had one rule concerning his tools. Anybody want to know what it was? Put them up. Put them back where you found them. We weren't always so great at following that rule. And my dad is one of the most patient people you'd ever meet. But I think we tried that patience on a Saturday morning when he had a project to do and he can't find the hammer. It's not where it's supposed to be. Who had the hammer last? Kevin did. Nope, John did. Nope, Kevin did. Nope, John did. We would try to pass the buck. But they were my dad's possession. And Dad didn't mind sharing his possessions with me, with my brother. But he expected us to take care of his possessions and treat them with respect and put them where they belong. If we are Christians, we no longer belong to ourselves. We are now God's possession. And God expects us to treat ourselves with respect and to behave properly because we belong to Him. And if we mistreat ourselves or we misbehave, what we are doing is we are losing, thank you, brother, we are losing God's possession. Since we belong to God, we need to be a possession worthy of the Almighty. We need to be a possession that the Almighty can say, hey, look, this one belongs to me. This one is mine. So you see, God doesn't just kind of randomly say, hey, behave, and I'm not going to give you a reason. God gives us some reasons to behave. He doesn't just say, behave because I told you so. Behave because, well, I'm God and you're not, and I can make you. Because He could. But He doesn't say that. What God says is behave. Behave because, and then He starts listing all of these things. You're my nation. You're my priests. You're my possession. You're the race of people that I would have created in the beginning. Because I have recreated you, I have made you to be my house. I have made you to be my people. I have made you to be my family. I have made you to be all of these things, and these things are why I ask you to behave. I ask you to behave because of what I have given you and what I have made you and what I have allowed you to become through my grace and through my mercy. You see, because there's not a one of us in here that earned the opportunity to be a member of God's nation. Not a one of us has earned the opportunity to be a member of God's nation. We are only in God's nation if we are accepted by God. Not a one of us has earned the right to be a priest for God or to God. Not a one of us. We are only a priest if God gives us the right to be a priest through His grace and His mercy. We do not have the right to belong to God's race unless God gives us that right to be part of that race. We do not have the right to be His household, His people. We do not have the right to be His possession unless God gives us that right. Well, praise be to God, He gave us that right. He gives us that right through Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus came, and one reason we watch Jesus as Jesus lives so much, and one reason the Gospels become so alive to us, is that Jesus lived this life understanding all of these things. You see, Jesus knew He was God's Son first and a Jew second. And so when He meets the woman at the well, or the Samaritan woman, or anybody outside of His race that He should never have spoken to, guess what? He speaks to them. He realized He was God's priest. And so He didn't just go to those people who were already righteous. He went to people who needed a priest. And He was God's priest. He realized He was part of God's household. And He brought into that household people who He saw wanted to be part of God's family. You see, Jesus lived knowing that His behavior was because of who He was in relation to God. His behavior was required by God, not on some whim, but because this was who God made Him to be when God allowed Him to become incarnate. And He lived that way. And He lived to the cross that way because the cross was the ultimate sign that Jesus was exactly what God created Him to be. And conversely, exactly what He created us to be. And when He died on that cross, and when He put in that tomb, and when He was raised, that power of the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus freed us and gave us the grace and the mercy that allows us to be His people, to be His priest, to be His nation, to be His race. And that's why we are to behave. That's why we are to avoid some things. That's why we are to embrace other things. That's why we are to be who we are. We are to be who we are because God is who He is, and He's done what He's done. Not just because He said so. In fact, the beauty of it is that God did for us before we ever thought about doing for ourselves. Before we ever even knew we could be a priest or a chosen race or a holy nation or a people for God's own possession. God made it so before we ever even knew it was possible. And because of that, we are called to behavior. Behavior that glorifies the one who made us what we are. My life does not always match God's grace. My life does not always match God's mercy. In fact, it's failed so many times, I don't even want to count. But the glory is that God allows us to grow into what He has given us. We become a Christian, and then we grow into it. Go back to the very first part in chapter 2 and verse 2. Like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the Word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. You've got salvation if you're a Christian. But you have the responsibility to grow in to what God has given you, and to model your life like that, and to avoid things that the Bible says to avoid, and to embrace things the Bible says to embrace. If you failed to do that, you have the opportunity this morning to either become a Christian for the first time, to accept God as the architect and the builder of your life, the one who will now have control of you. If any of you think you've done a stellar job in your own life and you don't need God, well, that's fine. But I'm going to say most of you think you could have had some help building your life. All right? So if you want to take God as the architect and the builder of your life, you got that opportunity. You can become a Christian today without waiting. But maybe as a Christian you realize that you haven't always behaved like you have been created to behave. You don't have to do it publicly. You can. You can walk back there and you can hug somebody's neck and you can pray, and they'll pray with you. You can pray right where you sit. But whatever you do, let's resolve to behave like the people God has made us to be. Not because He said so, but because of what He has done for us.